My name is Ezra Castellanos, and I'm a fuel truck driver who survived the first 24 hours of the zombie outbreak. On March 15, 2024, I watched the world end while delivering 8,000 gallons of gasoline to Phoenix, Arizona. What started as a routine fuel stop became a nightmare when people began turning into flesh-eating monsters within 20 minutes of being bitten. I had to use my knowledge of fuel systems and black market connections to stay alive, while civilization collapsed around me. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I need to tell you about March 15, 2024, the day everything changed. I'm Ezra Castellanos, and I've been driving fuel trucks for over 12 years. In that time, I've logged more than 1 million miles across the American Southwest without a single major incident. I've delivered gasoline to remote desert towns, navigated through blizzards in the Rockies, and handled every kind of road emergency you can imagine. I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. That morning started like any other Tuesday. I woke up at 4:30 in my sleeper cab at a truck stop in El Paso, Texas. The plan was simple: haul 8,000 gallons of premium gasoline from the Valero refinery to a chain of gas stations in Phoenix, Arizona. It was a routine run I'd done dozens of times before, following Interstate 10 through New Mexico and Arizona. The pay was decent, and I had a side deal lined up in Phoenix that would put some extra cash in my pocket. You see, I wasn't just a regular fuel truck driver. I had what you might call a secondary business. Nothing too illegal, just skirting around some regulations here and there. I'd buy fuel at wholesale prices through my legitimate contacts, then sell it to cash-only customers who preferred to avoid certain paperwork. Small business owners trying to save on taxes, underground racing circuits, people who needed fuel off the books. It wasn't hurting anyone, and it helped me make ends meet in an industry where margins are tight. My truck was a 2019 Peterbilt 579 with a 40,000-gallon tanker trailer. I'd modified it myself over the years, adding extra auxiliary fuel tanks that gave me an additional 200 gallons of capacity. Most drivers thought I was paranoid, but I'd learned that in the fuel business you never know when you might need extra range. That morning in El Paso, those tanks were topped off with diesel, and I had no idea how crucial that extra fuel would become. The first strange thing I noticed was the CB radio chatter. I'd been hearing weird reports for 3 days straight, but that Tuesday morning the frequency seemed busier than usual. Truckers were sharing stories that didn't quite add up. A driver called Roadhog mentioned some incident at a Love's truck stop near Tucson where a guy in medical scrubs had attacked customers in the parking lot. Another driver, Desert Rose, talked about seeing emergency vehicles racing toward Phoenix all morning, more than she'd ever seen for a normal accident. At first I dismissed most of it. The trucking community loves to exaggerate, and weird stories travel fast on the CB. Every driver has tales about strange encounters at truck stops, aggressive panhandlers, or people acting crazy because of drugs or mental illness. But as I drove west through New Mexico that morning, the reports kept coming, and they started to follow a pattern that made my skin crawl. Every story involved someone acting extremely aggressive, usually biting or attacking other people. Every incident seemed to happen around populated areas, especially near hospitals or medical facilities. And in every case, the aggressive person seemed to ignore pain or injuries that should have stopped them. A trucker named Big Mike described watching a homeless man get tasered by police officers in Albuquerque, only to get back up and continue attacking people like nothing had happened. Around 8 in the morning, I picked up emergency service radio chatter bleeding through the CB frequencies. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes emergency channels would overlap with trucker communications, especially in mountainous areas. But what I heard that morning was different. Dispatchers were using terms like multiple casualties, unknown illness, and escalating situation. One transmission mentioned something about hospitals in Phoenix being overwhelmed with violent patients. I remember thinking that maybe there was some kind of drug contamination going around, maybe a bad batch of synthetic drugs that was making people violent. I'd heard about that happening in other cities. But the more I listened, the more concerned I became. The incidents weren't isolated to drug users or homeless populations. They were happening to hospital workers, store clerks, ordinary families. By 9:30, I was approaching the Arizona border, and I had a decision to make. The rational part of my brain said these were just isolated incidents blown out of proportion by trucker gossip and emergency service overreaction. Phoenix was a big city. Weird stuff happened in big cities all the time. My delivery was worth $3,000 and I had another $2,000 waiting for me from my side deal. But my gut was telling me something else entirely. In 12 years of driving, I'd developed good instincts about when to avoid certain routes or areas. I'd driven through riots, natural disasters, and every kind of civil unrest you can imagine. There was something about the pattern of these reports that felt different, more dangerous than anything I'd encountered before. The CB radio crackled with another transmission from Desert Rose. She was ahead of me on Interstate 10, already in Arizona. Her voice sounded shaky, which was unusual because she was normally one of the calmest drivers on the road. She reported that emergency vehicles were racing past her convoy every few minutes, all heading toward Phoenix. Fire trucks, ambulances, police, even National Guard vehicles. She said she'd never seen anything like it in 20 years of driving. That's when I made my first crucial decision. Instead of taking the direct route into Phoenix, I decided to stick to the truck route that would take me around the south side of the city. It would add about an hour to my drive, but it would keep me away from the downtown area, where most of the emergency activity seemed to be concentrated. I told myself I was just being cautious, that I'd complete my delivery and get out of town as quickly as possible. Around 10 in the morning, the CB chatter picked up again. A driver called Hammer was reporting from a Flying J truck stop just outside Phoenix. His voice was tight with tension as he described what he'd witnessed. A customer had collapsed in the store, and when paramedics arrived, the person had become violent and attacked one of the EMTs. Hammer said it took 4 people to restrain the patient, and even then, they couldn't seem to calm him down. What made Hammer's report especially disturbing was his description of the patient's appearance. He said the person's skin looked gray and sweaty. Their eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, and they seemed to have no awareness of their surroundings except for an overwhelming desire to bite and attack anyone who came near them. Hammer was a veteran driver who'd seen everything, and I could hear genuine fear in his voice. Another driver, Moondog, chimed in with a similar story from a truck stop in Flagstaff. He described a woman who'd been acting erratically in the parking lot, stumbling around and making strange noises. When other customers tried to help her, she'd attack them with her teeth and fingernails. Moondog said the woman seemed to have incredible strength, fighting off multiple people even after being severely injured. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every incident involved people becoming suddenly violent and aggressive, focusing specifically on biting and attacking others. Every report described the attackers as having unusual strength and seeming immunity to pain. And every case seemed to involve people who looked sick or injured, with gray skin and unfocused eyes. By 11 o'clock, I was deep into Arizona, and the emergency radio traffic was becoming constant. Phoenix emergency services were declaring multiple code red situations across the city. Hospitals were reporting staff shortages due to violent patients, and several medical facilities were requesting police backup to maintain order. One transmission mentioned that Phoenix General Hospital was being evacuated due to an uncontrolled outbreak of aggressive behavior among patients and staff. That word, outbreak, sent chills down my spine. This wasn't random violence or a drug contamination. This was something spreading from person to person, something that was overwhelming. The medical system's ability to respond. I started thinking about diseases I'd heard of that could cause violent behavior. Rabies, maybe, or some kind of brain infection. But those didn't spread this quickly or affect this many people at once. The CB radio erupted with a panicked transmission from a driver called Smokey Joe. He was at a pilot truck stop just off Interstate 10, about 50 miles east of Phoenix. His voice was shaking as he described people running out of the convenience store, screaming about someone attacking customers inside. He said he could see blood on the windows and people fleeing in every direction. Smokey Joe's location was exactly on my planned route. The pilot station was where I always stopped to fuel up before making deliveries in Phoenix. I knew the layout, the staff, the regular customers. It was supposed to be my safe haven, my last normal stop before entering the chaos of city traffic. I had to make another decision. I could continue on my planned route and hope that whatever was happening at the truck stop had been resolved by the time I arrived. Or I could take a detour and find somewhere else to fuel up, somewhere that hadn't been affected by whatever was spreading through Phoenix. But as I thought about it, I realized there might not be anywhere safe. The incidents were spreading outward from Phoenix, affecting truck stops and communities along all the major highways. If I avoided one location, I might just be driving into another outbreak area. And my fuel gauges were showing that I needed to stop soon. The extra weight of my cargo was consuming diesel faster than usual, and I was already running closer to empty than I liked. The CB radio crackled again with an update from Smokey Joe. His voice was barely controlled panic as he described what he was seeing at the pilot station. People were attacking each other in the parking lot, biting and clawing like wild animals. He said he saw a man in a pilot uniform, someone who looked like an employee chasing customers across the asphalt. The employee's face was covered in blood, and he was making sounds that didn't seem human. That's when I heard the first official government announcement. An emergency broadcast system alert came through on the AM radio, interrupting the regular programming. A calm, official voice announced that there were reports of violent incidents in Phoenix and surrounding areas. Citizens were advised to avoid large gatherings, stay indoors if possible, and seek medical attention immediately if they felt ill or had been bitten or scratched by another person. The announcement was brief and vague, but it confirmed what I'd been piecing together from the CB radio reports. This wasn't just truckers exaggerating or emergency services overreacting. This was real, it was spreading, and it was serious enough for the government to issue public warnings. I checked my fuel gauges again. I had enough diesel to make it, another 100 miles. Maybe a little more if I drove conservatively. But I was hauling 8,000 gallons of gasoline, and my delivery schedule required me to be in Phoenix by 2 o'clock that afternoon. If I missed the delivery window, I'd face financial penalties that would wipe out most of my profit from the job. The rational part of my brain was still trying to convince me that this was temporary, that whatever was happening would be contained by the time I reached Phoenix. Cities dealt with emergencies all the time. They had procedures, resources, trained personnel. Surely the authorities would get the situation under control within a few hours. But my instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to get as far away from Phoenix as possible. I'd survived 12 years on the road by trusting those instincts, by recognizing when a situation was more dangerous than it appeared. And everything I was hearing told me that Phoenix was becoming a place where trucks and their drivers were not going to be welcome. Around noon, I made a compromise decision. I would continue toward Phoenix, but I would stop at the pilot station as planned. I knew the layout, I knew the staff, and I needed fuel regardless of what was happening in the city. If the situation at the truck stop was as bad as Smokey Joe had described, I would refuel as quickly as possible and then reassess my options. But I also started preparing for the possibility that I might need to abandon my delivery entirely. I moved my personal emergency supplies to the cab of the truck where I could access them quickly. I made sure my CB radio was tuned to the emergency channels, and I checked my fuel transfer equipment, making sure I could quickly fill my auxiliary tanks if I needed extra range to get out of the area. The CB radio delivered another update that made my blood run cold. Desert Rose, who had been ahead of me on the highway, reported that she was being diverted off Interstate 10 by a police roadblock. Officers were turning trucks away from Phoenix, telling drivers that the city was under emergency quarantine and that no commercial vehicles were being allowed in or out. This was the moment I realized that everything had changed. Quarantine wasn't something authorities implemented lightly. It meant that whatever was happening in Phoenix was completely out of control, that the normal systems for managing emergencies had failed. It meant that my delivery wasn't just delayed or complicated, it was impossible. But it also meant that I was running out of options. If Phoenix was under quarantine, I couldn't complete my delivery, which meant I wouldn't get paid. Worse, I might not be able to get out of Arizona at all if the quarantine expanded to cover the highways. I needed fuel, I needed information, and I needed to make some very difficult decisions very quickly. The pilot truck stop was still 30 miles ahead of me. According to my calculations, I would arrive there around 2:30 in the afternoon. Smokey Joe had stopped transmitting updates, which could mean either that the situation had calmed down or that it had gotten so bad that he'd left the area entirely. I tried calling the truck stop on my cell phone, but the call wouldn't go through. Cell service in rural Arizona was spotty under normal circumstances, but this felt different. The network seemed to be overloaded, probably from everyone trying to call their families or get information about what was happening. As I drove those final 30 miles, I started mentally preparing for what I might encounter. The best case scenario was that the incidents Smokey Joe had described were isolated, that the truck stop was back to normal operations, and that I could fuel up and figure out my next move. The worst case scenario was that the violence had spread, that the truck stop was no longer safe, and that I would have to find another way to get fuel and get out of Arizona. But as I crested a hill and saw the pilot sign in the distance, I realized that I hadn't prepared for what I was actually about to encounter. The parking lot was visible from the highway, and even from a mile away, I could see that something was very wrong. There were vehicles scattered randomly across the asphalt, some with their doors hanging open. I could see people moving around, but their movements looked strange, uncoordinated. And then I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. There was smoke rising from one section of the parking lot, and I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. But the emergency vehicles weren't moving. They were just sitting there, their lights flashing uselessly while chaos surrounded them. I downshifted and began to slow down as I approached the truck stop exit. Every instinct I had was telling me to keep driving, to get past this place and find somewhere else to stop. But my fuel gauges were telling me a different story. I was running low enough that skipping this stop would leave me dangerously close to empty, possibly stranded on the highway with no way to get help. As I turned off the interstate and drove toward the pilot station, I could see the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents or a temporary disturbance. This was complete chaos, the breakdown of everything that made a truck stop a safe, predictable place for drivers to rest and refuel. The scene in front of me was unlike anything I'd encountered in 12 years of driving, and I was about to drive right into the middle of it, carrying 8,000 gallons of highly flammable gasoline, with nowhere else to go and no way to turn back. That's when I realized that March 15th, 2024, wasn't just going to be another day on the road. It was going to be the day that everything I knew about the world came to an end. I pulled my Peterbilt into the pilot truck stop at exactly 2:30 that afternoon, and the first thing that struck me was how quiet everything seemed despite the chaos I could see unfolding. It was like watching a movie with the sound turned off. Cars were scattered across the parking lot at odd angles, some with their doors hanging wide open like their occupants had fled in panic. A few emergency vehicles sat motionless with their lights still flashing, but I couldn't see any paramedics or police officers around them. The fuel islands looked normal enough from a distance, but as I got closer, I noticed that several of the pumps had been abandoned mid-transaction. Fuel nozzles hung from their handles, dripping gasoline onto the asphalt. One pump had a credit card still sticking out of the reader, and there was a purse sitting on the ground next to it like someone had dropped it and run. I backed my trailer up to the diesel island, positioning it so I could make a quick exit if necessary. 12 years of driving had taught me to always think about escape routes, but that day it felt more important than ever. I left the engine running, something I normally never did while fueling, but nothing about this situation was normal. As I climbed down from the cab, I could hear sounds coming from the main building that made my skin crawl. There was shouting, but it didn't sound like normal human voices. It was more like animals making noise, guttural and desperate. Mixed in with that were other sounds that I couldn't immediately identify, but that filled me with dread. The first person I saw clearly was Tommy Hernandez, the afternoon cashier who I'd bought coffee from dozens of times over the years. Tommy was always friendly, always had a smile and a joke about the weather or the traffic. He was a good kid, probably 22 or 23 years old, working his way through community college. But the person I saw stumbling out of the convenience store wasn't the Tommy I knew. His pilot uniform was soaked with blood, and his skin had a grayish, waxy appearance that reminded me of raw chicken left out too long. His eyes were completely white, like someone had poured milk into his eye sockets. He was making a low moaning sound that didn't seem to come from his throat, but from somewhere deeper in his chest. Tommy was chasing a middle-aged woman across the parking lot. She was screaming and running as fast as she could, but Tommy was gaining on her with a strange, lurching gait that covered ground faster than it should have. When he caught her near a minivan, he tackled her to the asphalt with incredible force. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. Tommy bit into the woman's neck like he was trying to tear off a piece of meat. She screamed once, a sound so full of pain and terror that it made my hands shake. Then she went completely silent and motionless. Not dead. I could see her chest still rising and falling, but totally unconscious, like someone had flipped a switch in her brain. I grabbed my CB radio and started calling for help, but all I got was static mixed with panicked voices from other truckers reporting similar attacks across Arizona and New Mexico. The emergency channels were completely overwhelmed, with reports of what dispatchers were calling violent incidents and mass casualty events. Every transmission I heard described the same thing: people attacking others with their teeth, victims becoming unconscious, and emergency services being unable to cope with the volume of calls. While I was trying to make sense of the radio chatter, I kept watching Tommy and his victim. The woman lay perfectly still for what I timed at exactly 20 minutes. I checked my watch when she first went down, and I checked it again when she started to move. 20 minutes to the second. But when she got up, she wasn't the same person who had been running and screaming 20 minutes earlier. Her skin had the same grayish color as Tommy's, her eyes had gone completely white, and she was making the same inhuman moaning sound. She looked around the parking lot with a strange, predatory awareness, like she was hunting for something specific. That's when I understood the pattern. This wasn't random violence or some kind of drug reaction. This was something that spread from person to person through bites, and it changed people completely within exactly 20 minutes of infection. The timing was so precise that it had to be biological, some kind of virus or parasite that worked, with clockwork efficiency. I watched 3 more people get attacked and bitten while I stood next to my truck. Each time, the victim would fight and scream, then go completely unconscious for exactly 20 minutes, then wake up as something else entirely. Each time there was one more of these creatures and one less normal human being in the parking lot. The CB radio crackled with an update from a trucker called Roadhog, who was reporting from a Love's truck stop about 60 miles north of my location. His voice was tight with fear as he described watching a nurse from the local hospital bite a customer in the parking lot. What made his report especially terrifying was that he said the nurse had been trying to help the customer, who appeared to be injured. But when she got close enough to provide medical aid, she suddenly attacked, with no warning. That detail sent chills through me because it suggested that these creatures could still look and act human, right up until the moment they attacked. There was no way to tell who was infected and who was safe just by looking at them. The transformation seemed to happen all at once, like a switch being flipped from normal human being to something else entirely. Another transmission came through from Desert Rose, who had been turned away from Phoenix by the police roadblock. She reported that the officers manning the checkpoint had told her that hospitals throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area were being evacuated due to staff and patients becoming violent. She said one officer mentioned that Phoenix General Hospital had lost contact with their emergency room staff around noon, and that ambulances were no longer responding to calls in certain parts of the city. The implications of that information were staggering. If hospitals were being overrun, if medical personnel were becoming infected, then this wasn't something that could be treated or contained through normal medical procedures. Whatever was causing people to turn into these creatures was spreading faster than the healthcare system could respond to it. I was starting to fuel my truck when I heard glass breaking inside the convenience store. Through the windows, I could see more people stumbling around with that same grayish skin and white eyes. Some were wearing pilot uniforms. Others looked like customers who had been trapped inside when the chaos started. All of them were moving with that same predatory awareness, searching for something to attack. A family with 2 young children came running out of the store, the parents carrying their kids and running toward their car. But one of the creatures, a woman in a blood-stained dress, was right behind them. She moved faster than the parents expected, and she grabbed the father just as he was trying to get his family into their vehicle. The father fought back, pushing the woman away and shouting for his wife to get the kids in the car. But the infected woman had incredible strength, and she overpowered him within seconds. When she bit him on the shoulder, he screamed, and then went limp just like all the others I'd watched. His wife was screaming and trying to decide whether to help her husband or protect their children. I could see the impossible choice she was facing: stay and probably get killed or abandon her husband to save her kids. It was a decision no human being should ever have to make. That's when I made my first life or death decision of the day. I started walking toward the family, intending to help them get away. I wasn't armed and I didn't have any kind of plan, but I couldn't just stand there and watch children get attacked by these things. But before I could reach them, the father started to get up. It had been maybe 5 minutes since he'd been bitten, so I knew he still had 15 minutes before he would transform. I shouted to his wife that she had time to get him in the car, that they could still escape together if they moved fast. The woman looked at me like I was insane. She couldn't understand how I could know how much time they had, or why I was so certain about the timing. But something in my voice must have convinced her, because she started helping her husband toward their car while keeping the children behind her. They managed to get away, driving off toward the interstate while the infected woman who had attacked the father stumbled around looking for new targets. I watched their car disappear into traffic, and I hoped they would have enough time to get somewhere safe before the father transformed. But that incident taught me something crucial about the timing of the infection. People remained human for exactly 20 minutes after being bitten, which meant there was a window of opportunity to get them away from other potential victims. It also meant that anyone who had been bitten was essentially a ticking time bomb, dangerous to anyone around them once those 20 minutes were up. The CB radio erupted with panicked transmissions from truckers all across the Southwest. A driver called Big Mike reported that Interstate 40 through Flagstaff was blocked by abandoned vehicles and people wandering in the road. Another driver, Smokey Bear, said that the truck stop in Holbrook had been completely overrun, with dozens of infected people wandering around the parking lot attacking anyone who tried to stop there. But the most disturbing report came from a driver called Night Train, who was hauling a load of medical supplies to a hospital in Tucson. He said that when he arrived at the hospital loading dock, there were no staff members available to receive his delivery. The few people he saw in the hospital parking lot appeared to be infected, stumbling around with that characteristic grayish skin and white eyes. Night Train's report confirmed what I was starting to suspect. This outbreak had started in medical facilities and was spreading outward from there. Hospitals were supposed to be the safest places during a medical emergency, but they had become the epicenter of whatever was destroying human civilization. I finished fueling my truck and started thinking about my options. Phoenix was under quarantine, which meant I couldn't complete my delivery. But it also meant that normal transportation routes were being shut down, trapping anyone who didn't get out quickly enough. If I stayed in Arizona much longer, I might not be able to leave at all. The CB radio delivered another piece of crucial information. A driver called Hammer reported that he had been in contact with his dispatcher, who told him that the company was suspending all deliveries to Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of California due to what they were calling civil unrest. The dispatcher had also mentioned that several major trucking companies were advising their drivers to avoid populated areas entirely until the situation stabilized. That information told me that this wasn't just a local problem anymore. If trucking companies were suspending operations across multiple states, if they were telling drivers to avoid cities, then the outbreak was spreading far beyond Phoenix. The transportation network that kept America running was starting to shut down, which meant that society itself was beginning to collapse. I climbed back into my cab and tried to call my contact in Phoenix, the guy who was supposed to buy my extra fuel off the books. The call wouldn't go through. Cell service seemed to be getting worse by the hour, probably because the networks were overloaded with people trying to reach their families or get information about what was happening. While I was trying to make the call, I watched more people get attacked in the parking lot. Each time, the pattern was exactly the same. A person with gray skin and white eyes would grab a normal human being, bite them, and then the victim would go unconscious for 20 minutes before transforming into another one of these creatures. But I also noticed something else that would become important later. The infected people seemed to be drawn to movement and sound. They would ignore someone who was standing perfectly still, but they would immediately focus on anyone who was running or shouting. They also seemed to have enhanced hearing, turning their heads towards sounds that normal people might not even notice. The fuel pumps around me were starting to run out of customers as people fled the area or got attacked. I realized that this might be my last chance to top off my auxiliary fuel tanks before leaving Arizona. I had originally planned to save that fuel for emergencies, but this situation definitely qualified as an emergency. While I was filling my auxiliary tanks, I overheard a conversation between two other truckers who had stopped at the diesel island. They were debating whether to continue west toward California or turn around and head back east. One of them mentioned hearing reports that Los Angeles was experiencing similar outbreaks, while the other said that Texas was still relatively safe. That conversation made me realize that I needed to make a decision about where to go next. East toward Texas meant backtracking through territory that might already be infected. West toward California meant driving into areas where the outbreak might be even worse than what I was seeing in Arizona. North meant going through Flagstaff, which Big Mike had reported was blocked. South meant crossing into Mexico, which would create a whole different set of problems. The CB radio crackled with an emergency broadcast from the Arizona Department of Transportation. They were advising all commercial vehicle operators to avoid Phoenix and surrounding areas due to ongoing civil disturbances. They also announced that several highway sections were being closed to through traffic, and that truck drivers should contact their dispatchers for updated routing information. But when I tried to call my own dispatcher, the phone lines were completely jammed. It seemed like everyone in the trucking industry was trying to get information at the same time, and the communication systems couldn't handle the volume. I was essentially on my own, carrying 8,000 gallons of gasoline and 200 gallons of diesel, with no clear destination and no way to get guidance from my company. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The number of infected people in the parking lot was growing steadily, but the number of normal people was decreasing just as fast. It was like watching a mathematical equation play out in real time. For every person who got bitten, there was one more creature and one less human being. At the rate I was seeing people get infected, I calculated that the entire truck stop would be overrun within another hour or two. And if the same thing was happening at every truck stop, every gas station, every public place across Arizona, then the state would be completely lost within a matter of days. I finished fueling and started walking back toward my cab, but I stopped when I heard a woman shouting from inside the convenience store. She was trapped in there with several infected people, and she was begging for someone to help her. Every instinct I had told me to get in my truck and drive away, but I couldn't ignore someone who was about to die if no one intervened. I looked around the parking lot for anything I could use as a weapon. There was a tire iron in my truck, and I had a heavy flashlight that could probably do some damage, but I had no idea how many infected people were inside the store, or whether I would be able to get the woman out without getting bitten myself. The shouting from inside the store was getting more desperate and more panicked. I could hear glass breaking and merchandise falling off shelves. Whatever was happening in there was getting worse by the second, and pretty soon it would be too late to help anyone. That's when I had to make the second life or death decision of the day. I could try to rescue the woman and risk getting infected myself, or I could prioritize my own survival and leave her to face whatever was waiting inside that store. The decision I made in that moment would determine not just whether I survived the next few minutes, but whether I could live with myself for the rest of however long I had left in this new world that was rapidly replacing everything I had known. I made the decision to save myself. I grabbed my tire iron and heavy flashlight, but instead of going into that convenience store, I ran back to my truck and fired up the engine. The woman's screaming was getting weaker, and I knew that within minutes she would either be dead or transformed into one of those creatures. I couldn't save her without risking my own life, and I had to face the reality that in this new world, individual survival had to take priority over heroic gestures. As I pulled away from the pilot station, I could see in my mirrors that the parking lot was becoming completely overrun. More infected people were stumbling out of the convenience store, and they were starting to surround the few remaining normal humans who were trying to get to their vehicles. The mathematical equation I had observed earlier was accelerating. Within another hour, there wouldn't be a single uninfected person left at that truck stop. I merged back onto Interstate 10 heading west, but immediately realized that the highway situation was becoming impossible. Traffic was at a complete standstill, with abandoned vehicles scattered across all lanes. Some cars were still running with their doors hanging open, suggesting that their occupants had fled on foot. Others appeared to have been in accidents, with debris and broken glass spread across the asphalt. Between the abandoned vehicles, I could see people walking along the highway. But their movements had that same unnatural, lurching quality I had observed at the truck stop. They were infected, and they were wandering aimlessly along the interstate, probably drawn by the sound of car engines and the movement of the few vehicles that were still trying to navigate through the chaos. I had to make a crucial decision about routing. Continuing west toward Phoenix meant driving directly into the heart of the outbreak, where the quarantine was in effect, and emergency services had already been overwhelmed. But turning around and going back east meant fighting against traffic and potentially driving into areas that were just beginning to experience their own outbreaks. The CB radio provided some guidance when Desert Rose transmitted an update about conditions on the eastern routes. She had managed to turn around and was heading back toward New Mexico, but she reported that Interstate 10 was becoming clogged with vehicles fleeing Arizona. More importantly, she mentioned seeing infected people at several truck stops along her route, suggesting that the outbreak was spreading eastward along the major transportation corridors. That information confirmed my worst fears about how this infection was spreading. Truck stops, gas stations, and rest areas were perfect incubators for transmission because they brought together large numbers of people from different geographic areas. An infected person could bite someone at a truck stop in Arizona, and that person could drive hundreds of miles before transforming and starting a new outbreak cluster. I decided to head north instead, taking Highway 87 toward Flagstaff. It would add significant distance to any escape route, but it would also take me away from the heavily traveled interstate corridors where the infection seemed to be spreading most rapidly. The CB radio reports about Flagstaff being blocked were concerning, but they were several hours old, and the situation might have changed. As I worked my way through the stalled traffic toward the Highway 87 exit, I started seeing things that made me understand how quickly society was collapsing. There were emergency vehicles abandoned on the shoulder, their lights still flashing but no personnel in sight. I passed a school bus that had been evacuated, with children's backpacks and school supplies scattered around it on the ground. Most disturbing were the signs that people were already starting to turn on each other. I saw evidence of vehicles that had been broken into and looted, probably by people desperate for supplies or transportation. Near one overpass, there were several cars that appeared to have been in a deliberate collision, as if someone had used their vehicle as a weapon against other drivers. The CB radio crackled with a transmission from Big Mike, who was now reporting from somewhere north of Flagstaff. His earlier report about the highway being blocked had been accurate, but he had found a way around using Forest Service roads. More importantly, he mentioned that the rural areas seemed to be less affected than the cities and major highways. Small towns and isolated communities hadn't experienced the rapid spread that was overwhelming urban areas. That information gave me hope that there might still be safe places to go, areas where the infection hadn't yet taken hold. But it also suggested that my best chance for survival lay in avoiding populated areas entirely, which would make fuel and supplies much harder to obtain. I reached Highway 87 and started heading north, but immediately encountered a new problem. The two-lane highway was jammed with vehicles trying to escape the Phoenix area, and traffic was moving at maybe 5 or 10 miles per hour. At that rate, it would take me 6 or 7 hours to reach Flagstaff, assuming the road remained passable at all. Worse, the slow-moving traffic was creating perfect conditions for the infection to spread. I could see infected people moving between the stalled vehicles, attacking occupants who couldn't escape quickly enough. Every few minutes, I would hear screaming from somewhere ahead of me in the traffic jam, followed by the characteristic 20-minute silence followed by more screaming as newly infected people began attacking others. The fuel situation was also becoming critical. My main tanks were full, but the slow speed and constant idling in traffic were consuming diesel faster than normal highway driving. I calculated that I had maybe 8 hours of fuel at current consumption rates, which wasn't enough to reach any major city outside the outbreak zone. That's when I remembered the off-the-books fuel depot I had been planning to visit near Phoenix. It was a small operation run by a guy named Martinez, who sold fuel to independent truckers and construction companies without asking too many questions about paperwork. The depot was located on a ranch about 30 miles north of Phoenix, accessible by back roads that probably weren't experiencing the traffic problems of the major highways. Under normal circumstances, visiting Martinez's depot would have been a routine business transaction. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I had no way of knowing whether the depot was still operational, or whether Martinez and his crew had been affected by the outbreak. However, the depot represented my best chance of obtaining enough fuel to get out of Arizona entirely. Martinez always kept several thousand gallons on hand, and his location was isolated enough that it might have escaped the chaos affecting more populated areas. It was a risk, but staying in the traffic jam on Highway 87 was also a risk that was becoming more dangerous by the hour. I made the decision to leave the highway and try to reach Martinez's depot using county roads and ranch access routes. It meant abandoning the relative safety of being surrounded by other vehicles, but it also meant escaping the traffic jam that was becoming a death trap for everyone stuck in it. The CB radio provided another crucial piece of information as I was making this decision. A driver called Moondog reported that he had been in contact with a fuel distributor in Texas who was still operating normally. The distributor had confirmed that the outbreak was primarily concentrated in Arizona and parts of New Mexico and California, but that most of Texas remained unaffected. That report gave me a destination. If I could get enough fuel to reach the Texas border, I might be able to find safe areas where normal commerce was still functioning. But Texas was over 400 miles away, and most of that distance would have to be covered through territory that might already be infected or in the process of becoming infected. I pulled off Highway 87 onto a county road that I knew led toward Martinez's ranch. The road was mostly empty except for a few other vehicles that had apparently had the same idea about avoiding the main highways. For the first time in hours, I was able to drive at normal highway speeds, and the sense of making progress was psychologically important, even though I was heading into unknown territory. The rural landscape around me looked deceptively normal. Cattle were grazing in pastures, farm equipment was parked in fields, and ranch houses sat peacefully in the distance. If I hadn't known what was happening in Phoenix and along the major highways, I might have thought this was just another normal day in rural Arizona, but the CB radio kept reminding me that normalcy was an illusion. Reports were coming in from truckers across the Southwest describing the complete breakdown of normal transportation and commerce. Truck stops were being abandoned, fuel supplies were running low, and communication systems were becoming increasingly unreliable. One report that particularly concerned me came from a driver called Hammer, who had been trying to reach his family in Albuquerque. He said that when he finally got through on his cell phone, his wife told him that their neighborhood was being evacuated because infected people were wandering through residential areas attacking anyone they encountered. She mentioned that the attacks seemed to be happening randomly, with no pattern that would allow people to predict where they might be safe. That information suggested that the infection was moving beyond the initial outbreak areas and beginning to affect communities that should have been relatively isolated from the main transmission routes. If suburban neighborhoods in Albuquerque were being evacuated, then nowhere was really safe from this spreading catastrophe. I reached the access road leading to Martinez's fuel depot around 4 o'clock that afternoon. The ranch property looked normal from the entrance, with no signs of the chaos that was consuming other parts of Arizona. But as I drove down the gravel road toward the depot facility, I started noticing details that made me nervous. There were several vehicles parked around the depot buildings, but they were positioned randomly rather than in the organized way that Martinez usually maintained his operation. One pickup truck had its doors hanging open, and there were papers and other debris scattered around it on the ground. A piece of equipment that was normally kept inside one of the buildings was sitting outside, as if someone had been using it and then abandoned it in the middle of a task. Most concerning was the absence of any people. Martinez's operation usually had 3 or 4 workers on duty during daylight hours, and Martinez himself was almost always on site supervising operations. But I couldn't see anyone moving around the buildings or working with the fuel storage tanks. I parked my truck at a distance that would allow me to escape quickly if necessary, and I approached the main building cautiously. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual because Martinez was normally very security conscious about his operation. Inside, the office looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of normal business activities. There were invoices on the desk, a coffee cup that was still warm, and a CB radio that was turned on but receiving only static. The fuel storage area was more disturbing. Several of the storage tanks had been accessed recently, with fuel hoses lying on the ground and puddles of gasoline and diesel around the pump stations. But the equipment hadn't been properly secured, suggesting that whoever had been using it had left in a hurry or had been interrupted in the middle of the operation. I called out for Martinez and his crew but got no response. The silence was complete except for the sound of wind moving through the buildings and the distant CB radio static. It felt like walking through a ghost town, except that this ghost town had been abandoned within the last few hours rather than decades ago. That's when I found the first sign of what had happened to Martinez and his people. Behind one of the storage buildings, there was a large puddle of blood on the gravel, along with torn clothing and what looked like personal belongings scattered around the area. The blood was still wet, indicating that whatever had happened here had occurred very recently. I followed a trail of blood droplets that led from the first puddle toward a small equipment shed about 50 yards away. The shed door was hanging open, and I could hear sounds coming from inside that made my skin crawl. They were the same inhuman moaning sounds I had heard from the infected people at the pilot truck stop. I approached the shed carefully, using my tire iron as a weapon and staying ready to run if necessary. Inside the shed, I found what was left of Martinez's crew. 3 people were moving around in the cramped space, but they had the same grayish skin and white eyes that I had seen in the infected people at the truck stop. They were trying to get out of the shed, but they seemed to have trouble with the concept of doors and were just pushing against the walls randomly. One of them had been Martinez himself. I recognized his distinctive work clothes and the scar on his left hand that he had gotten from a piece of equipment years earlier. But the person stumbling around in that shed wasn't the Martinez I had known. It was something else wearing his body, something that had no memory of our business relationship or any human thoughts at all. The other 2 infected people appeared to be his regular crew members, people I had met and done business with on multiple occasions. Seeing them transformed into these creatures was more disturbing than encountering infected strangers, because it made the horror personal and immediate. I closed the shed door and secured it with a piece of equipment, trapping the 3 infected people inside. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would keep them contained while I figured out what to do about fuel. The depot still had several 1,000 gallons of gasoline and diesel available, but accessing it would require operating equipment that I had never used before. The CB radio in Martinez's office crackled with a transmission that made my situation even more urgent. A driver called Roadhog reported that he was seeing infected people wandering along rural roads throughout central Arizona. His report suggested that the outbreak was no longer confined to urban areas and major highways, but was spreading into the countryside through individual infected people who were walking or driving away from the initial outbreak zones. That meant Martinez's depot wasn't as isolated and safe as I had hoped. If infected people were wandering through rural areas, they could arrive at the depot at any time. And if they were drawn to sound and movement as I had observed at the truck stop, then operating the fuel equipment would probably attract any infected people within several miles of the location. I had to make another crucial decision. I could try to quickly obtain enough fuel to reach Texas, risking that I would attract infected people to the depot while I was operating the equipment. Or I could abandon the depot and try to find fuel elsewhere, accepting that I might not have enough diesel to reach safety. The decision was made for me when I heard the sound of vehicles approaching the depot from the access road. Through the office window, I could see 2 pickup trucks driving toward the facility, and the people in them appeared to be normal humans rather than infected creatures. But in this new world, other people weren't necessarily friends or allies. They might be desperate enough to take fuel by force, or they might be infected people who were still capable of driving, but would transform at any moment. I grabbed the CB radio from Martinez's office and went back to my truck, preparing to either trade with these newcomers or defend myself against them. Either way, my time at the fuel depot was about to become much more complicated and dangerous. The lead pickup truck pulled up next to my semi, and I could see that it was occupied by a family, 2 adults and what appeared to be 3 children. They looked desperate and frightened, and their vehicle was loaded with suitcases and other belongings like they were fleeing from somewhere in a hurry. The driver, a man in his 40s, got out of his truck and approached my cab with his hands visible, indicating that he wasn't armed or threatening, but I kept my tire iron within reach and stayed ready to drive away if the situation went bad. In this new world, trust was a luxury that could get you killed. What happened next would determine whether I could get the fuel I needed to escape Arizona, and whether these other survivors would become allies in the fight for survival or competitors for the same resources that we all needed to stay alive. The man who approached my truck introduced himself as David Chen, and he was traveling with his wife Sarah and their 3 children aged 8, 12, and 15. They had been living in a suburb north of Phoenix when the outbreak started, and they had fled their home that morning when infected people began wandering through their neighborhood attacking residents. David's story confirmed what I had been piecing together from CB radio reports. The infection wasn't just spreading through truck stops and highways. It was moving into residential areas as infected people wandered away from the initial outbreak zones. He described watching his next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who had always been friendly and helpful, stumble out of his house, with gray skin and white eyes, and attack a jogger who was running past on the sidewalk. What made David's account especially disturbing was his description of how quickly their neighborhood had collapsed. Within 3 hours of the first attack, most of the houses on their street were either empty or contained infected people. The local police had stopped responding to calls and emergency services had completely broken down. By noon, David realized that staying in their home meant waiting to die. Sarah Chen was holding their youngest child, a 8-year-old girl who kept asking when they could go home. Sarah's eyes had the hollow look of someone who had seen too much horror in too short a time. She told me that they had tried to reach other family members by phone, but the cell networks were either jammed or completely down. They had no idea whether their relatives were alive, dead, or transformed into those creatures. The second pickup truck contained an older couple, Jim and Betty Morrison, who had been traveling through Arizona when the outbreak started. They had been staying at a motel in Flagstaff when infected people began attacking guests in the parking lot. Jim showed me bite marks on his forearm that he had gotten while fighting off an infected motel clerk, but he assured me that the attack had happened more than an hour ago and nothing had changed about how he felt. That information set off alarm bells in my head. Based on my observations at the pilot truck stop, people transformed exactly 20 minutes after being bitten. If Jim had been bitten over an hour ago and was still normal, then either my timing, calculations were wrong, or the infection didn't always take hold immediately, or Jim was about to transform at any moment. I shared my 20-minute rule with the group, explaining what I had observed about the precise timing of the transformation process. David and Sarah looked skeptical, but Jim went pale when he realized the implications. If I was right about the timing, then he should have transformed already. The fact that he hadn't could mean that he was somehow immune, or it could mean that the bite hadn't actually broken his skin deeply enough to transmit the infection. Betty Morrison examined her husband's bite marks more closely and confirmed that they were relatively shallow, more like scratches than deep puncture wounds. The infected motel clerk had been wearing dentures, and apparently the artificial teeth hadn't been able to penetrate Jim's skin effectively. It was a piece of luck that had probably saved not just Jim's life, but the lives of everyone in their group. The Chen family's situation was more complicated. David had been bitten while fighting off an infected neighbor, but his bite had occurred only 15 minutes earlier. According to my timing observations, he had about 5 minutes left before he would transform. The family was clustered around him, not understanding that he was about to become the very thing they were fleeing from. I had to make one of the hardest decisions of my life. I could tell the family what was about to happen to David, giving them a chance to get away from him before he transformed. But doing so would probably cause panic and chaos that could get people killed. Or I could stay quiet and hope that my timing calculations were wrong, risking that David would transform and attack his own family. I chose to tell them the truth. I explained to Sarah that she needed to get her children away from David immediately, that based on what I had observed, he was going to transform into one of those creatures within the next few minutes. The family's reaction was exactly what I had feared. Sarah started crying, the children began screaming, and David became angry and defensive. David insisted that he felt fine, that nothing was wrong with him, and that I was trying to scare his family for no reason. But even as he was arguing with me, I could see the first signs of the transformation beginning. His skin was starting to take on that grayish color, and his eyes were becoming slightly unfocused. Sarah saw the changes too, and the look of horror on her face was heartbreaking. She was watching her husband, the father of her children, slowly turning into something that would try to kill them all. The children were too young to fully understand what was happening, but they could sense their mother's terror and they started crying harder. I told Sarah to get the children in her truck and drive away immediately. I offered to give them directions to roads that might be safer than the main highways, and I promised to share what fuel I could spare if they were running low. But the most important thing was to get them away from David before the transformation was complete. David was becoming increasingly agitated, but I could tell that he was fighting against the mental changes that were part of the infection process. For brief moments, he seemed like his normal self, concerned for his family and trying to understand what was happening to him. But those moments were becoming shorter and less frequent as the infection took hold of his brain. Sarah made the agonizing decision to save her children. She loaded them into their truck and started the engine, even though David was begging her not to leave him. The children were screaming for their father, not understanding why their mother was driving away from him. It was a scene that will haunt me for the rest of my life, watching a family torn apart by this infection in real time. David completed his transformation exactly 20 minutes after being bitten, just as I had predicted. One moment he was a concerned father trying to convince his wife not to abandon him, and the next moment he was a creature with gray skin and white eyes that began stumbling toward the sound of the truck engine. Sarah drove away with tears streaming down her face, leaving her transformed husband behind at the fuel depot. The Morrison couple had witnessed the entire horrific scene, and they were deeply shaken by watching a normal family destroyed within minutes. Betty was crying, and Jim was staring at his own bite marks with renewed concern, even though we had determined that his wounds weren't deep enough to cause infection. But the immediate crisis had taught me something important about group dynamics in this new world. People who had been bitten couldn't be trusted to isolate themselves voluntarily, even when they understood what was going to happen to them. The infection seemed to affect judgment and decision-making, even before the physical transformation was complete, making infected people dangerous to their own families and friends. The situation at the fuel depot was becoming more complicated by the hour. I now had 3 infected people locked in the equipment shed, 1 newly infected person wandering around the facility, and a group of survivors who needed fuel and supplies but had no experience with operating the depot equipment. Jim Morrison turned out to have mechanical experience from his years working in the oil industry, and he was able to help me operate Martinez's fuel pumps safely. But the process of transferring fuel was slow and noisy, and I was constantly worried that the sound would attract more infected people to our location. While we were working on fuel transfer, Betty Morrison monitored the CB radio for updates on conditions throughout Arizona and the surrounding states. The report she picked up painted a picture of complete societal collapse happening in real time. Phoenix was completely overrun, with no government services functioning and no organized resistance to the spreading infection. More disturbing were reports from other major cities across the Southwest. Tucson was experiencing massive outbreaks in multiple neighborhoods simultaneously. Albuquerque was under martial law, but military units were reportedly being overwhelmed by the sheer number of infected people. Las Vegas had lost contact with the outside world entirely, with no radio transmissions coming from the city for over 6 hours. The CB radio also picked up transmissions from individual survivors who were sharing information about safe routes and dangerous areas. A trucker called Desert Rose reported that Interstate 40 through eastern Arizona was completely blocked by abandoned vehicles and wandering infected people. Another driver, Big Mike, said that he had found refuge at a truck stop in eastern New Mexico, but that infected people were arriving there in increasing numbers. Most importantly, we heard a transmission from a nurse who had escaped from a Phoenix hospital before it was overrun. She provided crucial medical information about the infection, confirming my observations about the 20-minute transformation time, but adding details about how the infection spread and what happened to people's bodies during the transformation process. According to the nurse, whose name was Linda, the infection was transmitted through saliva and blood contact, which meant that any bite or scratch that broke the skin could potentially cause transmission. The 20-minute delay was caused by the time it took for the infectious agent to travel through the bloodstream to the brain, where it caused rapid and irreversible changes to brain tissue. Linda also confirmed that there was no known treatment or cure for the infection. Once someone was bitten, the transformation was inevitable unless the bite wounds were extremely shallow. She had seen dozens of people transform in the hospital, including doctors and nurses who had been trying to treat the infected patients. But Linda's most important contribution was information about how the infected people behaved. They were attracted to movement, sound, and the scent of living humans. They had enhanced strength and seemed to feel no pain, but they had lost all higher brain functions and operated on pure predatory instinct. Most importantly, they could only be stopped by destroying the brain tissue, which meant that traditional methods of stopping violent people were completely ineffective. This information changed how I thought about our situation at the fuel depot. The infected people I had locked in the equipment shed weren't just temporarily dangerous. They were permanently transformed and would remain threats for as long as they continued to exist. David Chen, who was now wandering around the depot facility, would never return to being the concerned father I had met an hour earlier. The CB radio crackled with an emergency transmission that made our situation even more urgent. A driver called. Hammer reported that he was seeing large groups of infected people moving along rural roads, apparently drawn by the sound of vehicle engines. He described convoys of infected people following cars and trucks, creating mobile infection zones that could spread the outbreak to previously safe areas. That report explained how the infection was spreading so rapidly across such large geographic areas. Individual infected people weren't just wandering randomly. They were being drawn toward sounds and activities that indicated the presence of living humans. Fuel depots, truck stops, and other facilities that generated engine noise and human activity were becoming magnets for infected people from miles around. I realized that our activities at Martinez's depot were probably attracting infected people to our location. The sound of diesel engines, fuel pumps, and CB radio transmissions were sending signals across the desert that would draw every infected person within hearing range directly to us. We needed to complete our fuel transfer and leave the area before we became surrounded. But even as we worked to finish fueling our vehicles, I could see infected people beginning to appear on the access road leading to the depot. They were walking slowly but steadily toward the facility, drawn by the sounds we were making. There were only 3 or 4 of them visible so far, but if Hammer's report was accurate, there could be many more following behind them. Jim Morrison had managed to fill both of our trucks with fuel, and we had also filled several spare containers that would give us extra range for the journey ahead. But the process had taken over 2 hours, and during that time the number of infected people approaching the depot had grown from a few individuals to what looked like a small crowd. Betty Morrison was monitoring multiple CB channels and picking up increasingly desperate transmissions from survivors throughout Arizona. A family trapped in their house in Scottsdale was begging for rescue, but no emergency services were responding to their calls. A group of construction workers who had taken refuge at a job site were reporting that infected people were climbing over their security fences. Most disturbing was a transmission from someone claiming to be a Phoenix police officer who said that the city's emergency command center had been evacuated after being overrun by infected people. According to this officer, there was no organized government response to the outbreak, and all emergency services had either been destroyed or had fled the area. The sun was beginning to set, which created a new set of problems for our survival. Driving at night would be more dangerous because we wouldn't be able to see infected people on the roads until we were almost on top of them. But staying at the depot overnight would mean being trapped there with a growing number of infected people surrounding the facility. I made the decision that we needed to leave immediately, even though it meant driving into uncertain territory, as darkness fell. The depot had served its purpose by providing us with fuel, but it was becoming a death trap as more infected people arrived and surrounded the buildings. We loaded our vehicles with as many supplies as we could carry from Martinez's facility, including food, water, tools, and additional fuel containers. I also took Martinez's CB radio and all of his road maps, knowing that navigation and communication would be crucial for survival in the days ahead. As we prepared to leave the depot, I had to make one final decision about the infected people we were leaving behind. David Chen was still wandering around the facility, and the 3 infected people were still locked in the equipment shed. Could try to eliminate them to prevent them from attacking other survivors who might come to the depot later. But doing so would mean killing people who had been human beings just hours earlier. I chose to leave them contained rather than trying to eliminate them. It wasn't a decision based on sentiment or hope that they might somehow recover. It was a practical choice about conserving ammunition and avoiding unnecessary risks. In this new world, every bullet and every moment of exposure to danger had to be carefully calculated. We formed a small convoy with my semi-truck in the lead and the 2 pickup trucks following behind. Our destination was the Texas border, over 400 miles away through territory that might already be overrun with infected people. But Texas represented our best hope for finding safe areas where normal society was still functioning. As we drove away from Martinez's fuel depot, I could see in my mirrors that the facility was being overrun by infected people who had been drawn there by the sounds we had made. Within minutes of our departure, dozens of creatures were wandering through the depot grounds, searching for the source of the activity they had detected. The sight of that overrun facility made me realize how quickly any location could change, from a safe refuge to a death trap. In this new world, nowhere was permanently safe, and survival would require constantly moving to stay ahead of the spreading infection. The night ahead would test every survival skill I had learned in 12 years of driving, and it would determine whether our small group of survivors could make it to safety or whether we would become just more casualties in the collapse of human civilization. We left Martinez's fuel depot around 6 o'clock that evening, just as the sun was beginning to set over the Arizona desert. Our convoy consisted of my Peterbilt semi-truck leading the way, followed by Jim and Betty Morrison in their pickup truck, and Sarah Chen with her 3 children bringing up the rear. We had enough fuel to reach Texas, enough food and water for several days, and enough weapons to defend ourselves against small groups of infected people. But as we drove away from the depot, I could see infected people emerging from the desert in increasing numbers. They weren't just the few individuals we had seen earlier. They were coming in groups of 10 or 15, all moving toward the sounds our vehicles were making. The CB radio reports about infected people being drawn to engine noise were proving accurate, and I realized that our convoy was essentially a mobile beacon, attracting every infected person within miles of our route. The first challenge came within 10 minutes of leaving the depot. We encountered a group of about 20 infected people scattered across the county road, forcing me to either stop and wait for them to move or drive through them with my semi-truck. Stopping meant risking that more infected people would arrive and surround our convoy, but driving through them meant using my truck as a weapon against what had recently been human beings. I made the decision to drive through them, using the massive weight and momentum of my loaded semi to clear a path for the pickup trucks following behind me. The impacts were horrible, but necessary for our survival. Each infected person I hit had been someone's family member, someone's friend, someone who had been living a normal life just hours earlier. But they were no longer human in any meaningful sense, and letting sentiment override survival instincts would get us all killed. The Morrison truck followed closely behind me, and Sarah Chen's truck stayed right behind them. We maintained tight convoy discipline because separating even briefly could be fatal if one vehicle encountered problems. The CB radio crackled with transmissions from other survivors reporting similar convoy tactics, confirming that group travel was becoming the standard survival strategy for anyone trying to escape the infected zones. As darkness fell, our situation became significantly more dangerous. The headlights of our vehicles were visible for miles across the desert, and I could see infected people emerging from the darkness and stumbling toward our route. They were coming from directions that shouldn't have had any infected people, suggesting that the outbreak had spread much farther and faster than anyone had realized. Betty Morrison was monitoring CB radio traffic and picking up increasingly desperate transmissions from across the Southwest. A group of survivors in Flagstaff reported that the entire downtown area had been overrun, with infected people wandering through the streets in groups of hundreds. A trucker convoy heading east through New Mexico had been attacked and scattered, with only 2 of the original 7 vehicles managing to escape. Most disturbing was a transmission from someone claiming to be a military officer who reported that organized military resistance to the outbreak had collapsed. According to this officer, military bases throughout Arizona and New Mexico had been overrun when infected personnel turned on their fellow soldiers. He said that there was no coordinated government response to the crisis and that military units were either destroyed, scattered, or operating independently without central command. That information meant that we couldn't count on reaching any kind of organized safe zone or government assistance. Whatever salvation existed would have to be found in areas where the outbreak hadn't yet reached, and we would have to rely entirely on our own resources and decision-making to reach those areas. The CB radio also picked up a transmission that would prove crucial to our survival strategy. A nurse named Linda, the same one who had provided medical information earlier, was broadcasting from a location near the Texas border. She reported that she had found a truck stop in eastern New Mexico that was still operating normally, with fuel available and no signs of infection among the staff or customers. Linda's transmission included specific directions to the truck stop and information about safe routes that avoided the most heavily infected areas. She also mentioned that she was treating bite victims who had arrived at the truck stop, and that she was able to provide medical care for people who had been injured during their escape from the outbreak zones. That truck stop became our immediate destination. It was about 200 miles from our current location, which meant 6 or 7 hours of driving through potentially infected territory, but it represented our best chance of finding fuel, supplies, and medical attention in a safe environment. More importantly, Linda's presence there meant we could get professional medical evaluation of Jim Morrison's bite wounds to confirm that he wasn't infected. The route to the truck stop took us through small rural communities that should have been relatively isolated from the main outbreak areas. But as we drove through these towns, we could see signs that the infection had already reached even the most remote locations. Streetlights were out in most areas, indicating power grid failures. Many buildings showed evidence of hasty evacuation, with doors left open and belongings scattered in yards and parking lots. In one small town called Cedar Ridge, we encountered our first organized group of infected people. They weren't just wandering randomly, they seemed to be moving together with a shared purpose, heading in the same direction as our convoy. There were at least 50 of them visible in our headlights, and they all turned toward our vehicles when they heard our engines. I had to make a split-second decision about whether to drive through the town or try to find an alternate route around it. Detouring would cost us time and fuel, but driving through meant confronting a larger group of infected people than we had faced before. The CB radio provided the deciding factor when Betty Morrison reported that she could see infected people approaching from behind us, cutting off our retreat route. We drove through Cedar Ridge at high speed, with infected people attacking our vehicles from all sides. They seemed to have no sense of self-preservation, throwing themselves at our trucks even though the impacts would certainly destroy them. Several of them managed to grab onto the Morrison truck, and Jim had to swerve violently to shake them off before they could break through the windows. Sarah Chen's truck was struck by multiple infected people, but the impacts didn't seem to damage the vehicle significantly. However, her children were screaming in terror, and I could hear Sarah crying as she struggled to maintain control of her truck while fighting off attackers. The psychological trauma of driving through a group of infected people was almost as dangerous as the physical threat, because it could cause drivers to make mistakes that would get everyone killed. We emerged from Cedar Ridge with all 3 vehicles intact, but the experience had shown us how quickly we could be overwhelmed if we encountered a larger group of infected people in a confined space. The rural roads we were traveling offered limited options for evasive maneuvers, and the desert terrain on both sides of the highway would be impossible to navigate with heavily loaded vehicles. The CB radio delivered more crucial intelligence as we continued toward the Texas border. A trucker called Roadhog reported that he had been monitoring emergency service frequencies and had picked up transmissions suggesting that the infection was spreading into Texas through the major highway corridors. According to his report, El Paso was beginning to experience outbreaks, and authorities were considering quarantine measures similar to those implemented in Arizona. That information meant that our window of opportunity for reaching safety was closing rapidly. If Texas implemented quarantine measures, we might find ourselves trapped between infected zones in Arizona and closed borders in Texas. We needed to reach the truck stop Linda had described, refuel and resupply quickly, and then continue east, before the outbreak spread far enough to cut off our escape routes. Around midnight, we encountered our most serious challenge of the journey. A bridge over a dry riverbed had been blocked by abandoned vehicles, creating a bottleneck that would force us to slow down significantly or find an alternate crossing. As we approached the bridge, I could see infected people wandering among the abandoned cars, and more infected people emerging from the desert on both sides of the road. I tried to contact Linda on the CB radio to get information about alternate routes, but her signal was weak and intermittent. The few words I could make out suggested that she was aware of the bridge problem and that there was another crossing, about 15 miles to the south. But reaching that crossing would require leaving the main highway and navigating on unfamiliar rural roads in complete darkness. Jim Morrison used his CB radio to suggest that we try to clear the abandoned vehicles from the bridge using the pushing power of my semi-truck. It was a risky strategy because it would require us to move slowly and make a lot of noise, but it might be faster than detouring to the alternate crossing. The decision would affect not just our immediate survival, but our fuel consumption and our ability to reach the truck stop before dawn. I made the decision to try clearing the bridge. I positioned my semi-truck to push the abandoned vehicles aside while the pickup trucks provided security by watching for infected people approaching from the flanks. The process was slow and noisy, exactly what I had feared, and it attracted infected people from across the desert who began converging on our location. But the strategy worked. Within 20 minutes, we had cleared enough space for all three vehicles to cross the bridge safely. The pickup trucks went first, followed by my semi-truck, and we were able to continue toward the truck stop without having to navigate unfamiliar detour routes. However, the noise and activity had attracted a large number of infected people to the bridge area, creating a hazard for any other survivors who might try to use that crossing later. The CB radio provided an update from Linda that gave us hope for reaching safety. She reported that the truck stop was still secure and operational, with about 30 survivors taking refuge there. She also mentioned that a group of truckers had established regular contact with safe areas in eastern Texas, confirming that there were still places where normal society was functioning. But Linda's transmission also included a warning that made our situation more urgent. She had received reports that infected people were moving eastward along the highway corridors, following the same routes that survivors were using to escape the outbreak zones. The truck stop security depended on staying ahead of this eastward migration, and that security could be lost if too many infected people reached the area. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we finally saw the lights of Linda's truck stop in the distance. It was a beautiful sight after 8 hours of driving through infected territory, but I remained cautious about our approach. Even legitimate safe areas could become death traps if they were overcrowded or poorly defended, and we needed to evaluate the situation carefully before committing ourselves to stopping there. The truck stop appeared to be well organized and defensible. Vehicles were parked in defensive positions around the main building, and I could see people with weapons maintaining watch positions at key locations. Most importantly, the infected people we had been seeing along the highway seemed to thin out as we approached the facility, suggesting that the survivors there had been successful in keeping the area clear. Linda met our convoy as we pulled into the truck stop parking area. She was a woman in her 40s wearing medical scrubs that were stained with blood and other substances I didn't want to think about. Despite everything she had been through, she maintained a professional demeanor and immediately began organizing medical examinations for our group. Her first priority was examining Jim Morrison's bite wounds to confirm that he wasn't infected. She cleaned and disinfected the wounds thoroughly, then monitored him for any signs of the early-stage transformation symptoms she had observed in other patients. After an hour of observation, she declared that the wounds were too shallow to have caused infection, confirming our earlier assessment that Jim had been incredibly lucky. Sarah Chen and her children required different kinds of medical attention. The children were suffering from severe psychological trauma after witnessing their father's transformation and spending 8 hours driving through infected territory. Sarah was exhausted and dehydrated, and she was struggling with grief and guilt over having to abandon her husband. Linda provided counseling and medical care that began the process of helping the family cope with their losses. The truck stop was serving as a coordination center for survivor groups throughout eastern New Mexico and western Texas. Linda had been collecting information about safe routes, fuel availability, and the current status of the infection in different areas. Her intelligence network included truckers, emergency service personnel, and military units that were still operating independently. According to Linda's information, the infection had spread throughout Arizona and most of New Mexico, but Texas was still largely unaffected except for areas immediately adjacent to the infected states. Eastern Texas was accepting refugees and providing assistance to survivors, but the state government was implementing screening procedures to prevent infected people from crossing the border. More importantly, Linda had received radio transmissions from survivor communities that were beginning to organize in areas that had successfully resisted the initial outbreak. These communities were establishing trade networks, coordinating defense strategies, and working to maintain some semblance of civilization in a world that had been fundamentally changed. The truck stop itself was preparing to relocate further east as the infection continued to spread in their direction. Linda estimated that they had maybe 24 to 48 hours before infected people reached their location, in numbers too large to repel. The plan was to move the entire survivor group to a more defensible location in eastern Texas, where they could continue providing assistance to refugees fleeing the infected zones. I had to make another crucial decision about my own future. I could continue traveling independently, relying on my fuel supplies and survival skills to reach whatever safe areas still existed. Or I could join Linda's group and contribute my trucking expertise to their collective survival efforts. Both options had advantages and risks, and the choice would determine not just my immediate survival, but what kind of life would be possible in this new world. The CB radio provided one final piece of information that influenced my decision. A transmission from eastern Texas described survivor communities that were specifically looking for people with transportation and logistics expertise. The collapse of normal supply chains meant that communities needed individuals who could organize fuel distribution, coordinate convoy movements, and maintain the transportation networks that would be essential for long-term survival. My 12 years of experience as a fuel truck driver, combined with my knowledge of transportation routes and fuel systems, made me valuable to these emerging communities in ways that I had never considered before. The skills that had been my livelihood in the old world were becoming essential survival abilities in the new world that was taking shape around us. As dawn broke over the New Mexico desert, I realized that the first 24 hours of the EU zombie outbreak had taught me everything I needed to know about survival in this changed world. The key lessons were simple but crucial. Trust your instincts about danger, understand the timing and transmission methods of the infection, maintain mobility and fuel supplies, work with other survivors when possible, and never hesitate to make the hard decisions that survival requires. The world that had existed on March 14, 2024 was gone forever, destroyed by an infection that could transform any human being into a creature driven by nothing but the need to attack and bite other humans. But the new world that was emerging offered opportunities for people who could adapt quickly and contribute useful skills to survivor communities. My journey from Phoenix fuel truck driver to zombie apocalypse survivor had taken exactly 24 hours. In that time, I had learned to kill infected people without hesitation, to abandon other survivors when necessary for my own survival, and to make life or death decisions based on incomplete information and desperate circumstances. But I had also learned that human civilization was more resilient than I had ever imagined. Even in the face of complete societal collapse, people were organizing to help each other, sharing resources and information and working to preserve some version of the world we had lost. The truck stop where we had found refuge was proof that cooperation and planning could create islands of safety, even in the midst of total chaos. The CB radio crackled with a transmission from a survivor community in eastern Texas that was coordinating supply runs for refugee groups throughout the region. They were specifically requesting fuel truck drivers who could help establish regular supply routes between safe areas. For the first time since the outbreak started, I heard an opportunity to use my skills in service of rebuilding rather than just surviving. As I prepared to leave Linda's truck stop and continue the journey toward whatever future awaited in this new world, I reflected on how much had changed in 24 hours. I had started the day as an independent trucker planning to complete a routine fuel delivery to Phoenix. I was ending it as a survivor of the zombie apocalypse, carrying refugees toward safety and preparing to join communities that were working to rebuild human civilization from the ruins of the old world. The infection that had destroyed Arizona and was spreading across the Southwest represented the end of everything familiar and predictable about human society. But it also represented the beginning of something new, something that would require all the skills, knowledge, and determination that survivors like me could contribute to the effort of building a world where human beings could continue to exist and thrive despite the presence of creatures that had once been our friends, neighbors, and family members. The 24 hours I had just survived were only the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would test every survival skill I possessed and require me to help create new forms of human community, adapted to the realities of a world where the dead had risen to hunt the living.